Hello and welcome to episode 21 of my friend the Rainbow Circle. And I wanted to, in the last few episodes, I wanted to track the creation of a story that is just a granule of a story. Because I think that's ultimately, if you're learning about how stories work and learning to improve your own stories, tracking the actual creation of a story is a good way to actually see that. I mentioned this in the Kurt Vonnegut episode, how little help, Maggie, how little help Kurt Vonnegut's advice is. Reading his books is a tremendous amount of help, but his actual advice is not much of a help. How I just... Stop. Be still. How I was told by a dream that I needed to create the story about two characters named Old God and the Broken Heart. An old god is a giant, and there are not a lot of stories about giants to take a look at just as models. Kurt Vonnegut's stories are magnificent for many things, but he doesn't have a story about a giant. One of the very few is The Handsomest Drowned Man in the World, which comes from Leaf Storm. It's in a couple of different collections, but Leaf Storm is just one of the collections it's in. I did not get it for $3.99. I think I actually got this for $1. But that's a different price tag entirely. At one point, it was $11. But The Handsomest Drowned Man in the World is a good one to take a look at, just to look at the handling of giants. Maggie shows up in a story as a giant. I turned Maggie into a giant in a couple of stories. A giant named Molly. For no reason, I just changed your name to a very similar name and turned you into a talking dog giant. Isn't that exciting? She has no idea what I'm saying. Her tail is wagging. She has no idea what I'm saying. Can you conceive of what a story is, Maggie? Can you conceive of what a story is? But I think eventually, probably at the beginning of September, I'll actually start writing the story. No real idea of what the story is about. It's about a giant. It's a living giant, and The Handsomest Drowned Man in the World is about a dead giant. I have written stories about dead giants. I have a bunch of stories about giants. I have one called Limp Gargantua, that was a riff on the same sort of thing as Handsomest Drowned Man in the World. Except somebody was selling the dead body in a store and just got it in an estate sale. Got this giant dead body. Wasn't sure what to do with it and just became friends with it. Basically, a ripoff of Handsomest Drowned Man in the World. But Handsomest Drowned Man in the World is a magical realist story, which I've been talking about genres. I would hardly call magical realism a genre, more so than just a mood, more so than anything. It doesn't really dictate any kind of a structure the way like a hero's journey does, or one of those micro-schematic genres like 80s romance, stuff like that. Those definitely have structural story components that are generic, and that's one of the problems with calling them genres. If you talk about magical realism being a genre, the implication is that it's generic, and that you have some expectations, whether it's structural or not. But it's more of a mood than anything else. And one of the ways to define magical realism, and I don't think that's a great name. I don't think most genres have terrible names, but one of the ways of defining magical realism is as seemingly magical or supernatural things treated as mundane. And that's not actually true of Handsomest Drowned Man. So that's, I would say the takeaway is that so much of it is right here in the center, the irrational response. And that's one reason why what I call 10,000 hoursing, just writing and reading is the best practice, because that helps you get in touch with your own recognition of whatever sort of irrational responses are most effective. That helps exercise the muscle of access to the most effective parts of the subconscious that access that irrational visceral response. But in actually shaping that, it's good to understand where it actually fits into the process of the actual story making. But there's no real dictation of, if you're talking about things like mood that you want to achieve, there's no dictation of right and wrong, really. If you want to achieve a magical realist sort of a mood, there are techniques that you can use. You can draw from things like Handsomest Drowned Man. Mm-hmm. But a clear, rational definition, like treating the magical as mundane, doesn't always pan out, because Handsomest Drowned Man, they treat the magical as magical. But it is a very condensed, simple version of the same sort of dynamic that actually works with the hero's journey. With the hero's journey, I have 2 dogs in here now. I've never made Siku a giant in a story. He's already kind of a giant. Siku's only been with us since April, so I haven't gotten around writing stories about him yet. Mankey's been with us 4 years, something like that. 4 years. Hey, Siku, you want to be a giant in a story? You want to be a giant in a story? You can be a giant. You could be a giant. I wouldn't have to exaggerate too much with you. You're in my way, by the way. I'm trying to shoot a show. At least you're not barking. Last 2 times you wouldn't just stop barking. What was I even saying, Siku? Okay. What was I saying? Oh yeah, the hero's journey. Something like, if you look at like a typical magical, whatever that means, but a typical magical realist story, you might think it's quite different from a hero's journey scheme. And if you look at like fantasy stories that tend to hit the, like a Lord of the Rings or something, or Harry Potter or whatever, they tend to hit most of the components in that hero's journey. I would say the primary difference would be more so mood than anything else. Sure, there are things like treating magic as something special, and there's a whole variety of different ways to really define that. Whether the magic is hidden like it is in Harry Potter, or whether it's just a part of the world as it is, as of a different world as it is with Lord of the Rings, what have you. There's a whole scale, and that's part of the problem with calling genre generic, or implying that genre is generic, because it's really not generic. There are expected components, but I would say the primary difference between magical realism and fantasy is the mood that it elicits, and it's not always a universal sort of a mood. It's just commonly there's a sense of uncanny versus a sense of mythological. So it's a sliding spectrum. I wouldn't say that it's easy to define, or it has been well defined in the past either. But my point about the hero's journey, it actually works the same. With the hero's journey, I still have that from last episode. There you go, familiar and unfamiliar. In the hero's journey, in your typical sort of fantasy story, very, very typical sort of fantasy story, even though there is extremely wide variety, you have a character who's taken from the familiar world into the unfamiliar world, and the reason that works, and to enhance the visceral core right there, that green in the middle there, is because the familiar is the destimulated end of the spectrum. Once your mechanical repetition leads to desensitization to, the novelty of what surrounds you. So, if you're familiar with your own home, you're closer to the destimulating end of the spectrum. And there's active ways to destimulate in order to force things into be repetitive. that run counter to the stimulating force that is essential to the vitality of a story. But the most basic dynamic, especially right at the beginning of a story, whether it's a hero's journey story or whether it's a magical realist story, is that we're in something familiar to the degree that it's no longer stimulating. So whether it is a fantasy kingdom where we're introduced to fantasy elements, but it's in a stable kingdom that has no real problems, or it could be dystopian and dark and gritty in a sci-fi story, I guess. Sci-fi is even more widely varying, but dystopian is subgenre. It could be a dystopian future where things are not good, but they're in a homeostasis. So it's not directly stimulating at the moment until something sets it on a path to come into conflict with the negativity of the world. But your typical fantasy story, it's even if it's another world, it's still stable. And most extreme version of that being in the Hobbit. The Hobbit world is very stable and mundane. Even if it's a fantasy world and they're fantasy creatures, it's still stable and mundane. In the hero's journey, there's something that prompts the hero out into the dangerous world, like the Hobbit or in the Lord of the Rings. Similar sort of dynamic in the beginning. Or the Muggle world into the magical world, or whatever sort of form of that there is. So it's taking it from the destimulating into the spectrum, moving it closer to that stimulating core. With viscerally stimulating things like danger of some sort of monster or some sort of villain, or Voldemort or Sauron or what have you. Those are threats that force the hero into a dangerous situation. That's your classic hero's journey dynamic, and why it really works. Whatever other components, if it's the 17 components or how many ever components, those are just functioning to essentially enhance that stimulation and our desire to resolve it. In magical realism, typically, as much as you can really say typically, the mundane element is set side by side with something that doesn't quite belong and creates this uncanny mood. And in Handsomest Drowned Man, it's this giant drowned man. And commonly that happens right at the beginning. As I actually start the Old God and the Broken Heart story, I'll do one about opening lines, which is when I worked in a bookstore. I started collecting Gabriel Garcia Marquez books when I worked in the bookstore 20 years ago. I got this at a used bookstore, but this particular one, I got it at a used bookstore. But I studied the first lines of as many books as I could. And that's kind of the 10,000 hoursing, whoever, any social psychologist, Malcolm Gladwell famously talks about this, having the opportunity to study something that you're interested in. And I was working in a bookstore. I had books all around me. So I just read all the first lines of all the books just to see some sort of pattern. But, a magical realist story, and you can lump Kafka in with this. Hunger artists, which I mentioned before. Hunger artists used to do this, and this. You start in this collective third that establishes hunger artistry as this mundane thing. Sorrows of a Family Man, it establishes the Odrodek as this really mundane thing. But as you describe it, that the contrast between the mundane treatment and the bizarreness of hunger artistry or the Odrodek contrasts with that mundane treatment. And Gabriel Garcia Marquez is great at that. 100 Years of Solitude, famously. The ice is this magical thing, whereas all of these ghosts and, all these other really magical things are, just mundane. And what that ultimately creates is a sense of the uncanny. So even though, it's hard to define universally all magical realist stories on a rational level as being as the magical treated as mundane, because Handsomest Drowned Man is an exception to that, is a mechanism for creating that uncanny effect. The first children who saw the dark and slinky bulge approaching through the sea let themselves think it was an empty ship. So treating the Handsomest Drowned Man, who's Esteban ends up being his name, treating him as an enemy ship. Treating him as this visceral threat, but also something fairly mundane, just an object. And I talked about objecthood and subjecthood before. Treating a character as a subject and with the capacity to make his or her own decisions. And Esteban is a dead man, so he can't really make his own decisions, but a lot of the dynamic of the story is projecting the subjecthood onto what is essentially an object. So starting out as this very mundane thing, just a ship, transfers that objecthood onto him at first, and transfers the sense of threat onto him at first. Then it had no flags or masts, and they thought it was a whale. When it washed up on the beach, they removed the clumps of seaweed, the jellyfish tentacles, and the remains of fish and flotsam, and only then did they see it was a drowned man. So, and that creates sort of the bizarre contrast. I haven't talked much about parataxis. I talked a little bit about parataxis when I talked about Allen Ginsberg poetry. But parataxis is the juxtaposition between two things that don't seem to belong together without a directly stated connection. So, seeing someone who looks like a ship and then seeing that it's a drowned man, that, already that sort of juxtaposition creates a visceral impact. And for Ginsberg, parataxis frequently functioned to create this sense of spiritual awe at the mystery of the universe. So it created a somewhat similar sort of uncanny effect as a magical realist piece. And so you see parataxis there right at the beginning with this Handsomest Drowned Man, Esteban, treating a drowned man like a whale or a ship. Semi-clearly, it's establishing the unusual nature of him right up front. They're going to start tearing things up and making a lot of noise. They had been playing with him all afternoon, burying him in the sand and digging him up again. So treatment of him is mundane. Even if it's just a drowned man, you do have still, if it's just a normal drowned man, you still have an uncanny effect there. I'm not going to read the whole thing. It's about 4 pages, so it's, it's not too long. In this printing, it's 4 pages. So just that continuous treatment of him as mundane. He had the smell of the sea about him, and only his shape gave one to suppose that it was a corpse of a human being, because the skin was covered with a crust of mud and scales. So constantly moving between objecthood of him merely being this object floating up, subjecthood of him being a human being. So in this case, he's barely a human being. The treatment of the children as just a plaything, gives him a sense of objecthood there. But also association with something just natural, like a whale. So there's a disquieting sort of effect of uncertainty about who he is. And even a line like, it had no flags or masts. There are lots of those sorts of moments just spread throughout. And that establishes it right up front. But lots of moments like that just spread throughout, where there's no really certain identifier of who Esteban is. It's just constantly, they wonder who he is, and there's no identifier. So that mystery about who he is, that creates an uncanny effect, too. And I talked about that a bit when I talked about Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes stories, you wouldn't call them magical realists, but they have a very similar sort of mood at first. They're not magical realists because the trajectory of the story, the schema, the really tight schema, the really tight genre of the story is that you inevitably expect, the detective or Sherlock Holmes, whatever detective it is, Poirot or Miss Marple, you ultimately do expect them to actually explain it at one point, and if they don't, it becomes disappointing because of the expectations of the genre. But the mood ends up being fairly similar. It's this unresolved mystery. Magical realist stories tend to leave that more open-ended. Who is the handsomest drowned man? Spoiler alert, we never find out. Why is he a giant? Spoiler alert, we never find out. And then ultimately we find out that he's very, very handsome. Not only was he the tallest, strongest, most virile and best-built man they'd ever seen, but even though they were looking at him, there was no room for him in their imagination. They could not find a bed in the village large enough to lay him on, nor was there a table solid enough to use for his wake. The tallest man's holiday pants would not fit him. So he's gigantic. And so they're caring for him, partly because he's so handsome that everybody falls in love with him, starting with the women of the village. They thought that if that magnificent man had lived in the village, his house would have had the widest doors and the highest ceilings and the strongest floor. They start to project in their imagination who he might be. So they give him subjecthood. He starts off sort of this free-floating identity. Is he an object in the ocean? Is he part of nature? He has so few identifying qualities to him except for his largeness and his handsomeness. And because he's sort of this blank slate, they all start projecting onto him their imagination. And it's a collective third, which is more common in magical realism. Kafka does it. Lots of South American writers do it. For whatever reason, that particular POV is much more common. And it's entirely possible to do that collective third of the whole village felt this way. And you see that in things like, the virgin suicides, for example. Every once in a while, you'll see people use that collective third. And it's a tricky one to get right, because ultimately still, just going back to what I was talking about defining a protagonist. A protagonist is someone you like and want to succeed for irrational reasons. An antagonist is someone you don't want to succeed. But they're both stimulating. They're both viscerally stimulating. But the only real distinguishing factor is just whether or not you want them to succeed. So how do you make a whole village likable? And a lot of the times they're just functioning as a whole unit in this particular case. And I play around with the tense a lot of the times I do that with time instead of just a collective third. Because saying things, this is what they would do over time. These actions become collective actions. So it's just a fun sort of tense to really play with. And they hated that in workshops. And they were like, don't say would, say is. And I said, thank you for your opinion. No, thank you. I'm just going to do what I want to do. I don't know why that is supposed to be helpful. Trying to do something a little bit unique and different to create a voice that is mine. But yeah, stuff like POV, a lot of workshops are really fixated on consistent POV, and there's, part of the conformity of the system is that it tends towards the close third tends to be the one that is favored because it's the easiest one to work with, and that kind of drives me crazy sometimes that I just fall into the close third just because it's really easy to work with. If I'm struggling to get like emotional resonance with a character, I guess I'll go with close third. And collective thirds real hard to do. Gabriel Garcia Marquez does it perfectly. But this is one of the only moments when it shifts into more of a specific close third. If you can even call it close third. The oldest woman had looked upon the drowned man with more compassion than passion sigh. He has the face of someone called Esteban. And so Esteban ends up being the only one with any sort of a name. And really the only one with much of a character really is Esteban, and all that comes through the projections of their imagination of what he must be like. And so you have characterization, and this gets into that second level sort of characterization. Just a pure visceral impact of irrational visceral impact of this giant dead man. Has a lot of that core sort of stimulation. They could see him in life, condemned to going through doors sideways, cracking his head on cross beams, remaining on his feet during visits, not knowing what to do with his soft pink sea lion hands, while the lady of the house looked for her most resistant chair and begged him, frightened to death, "Sit here, Esteban, please." And he leaned against the wall, smiling. "Don't bother me." So they're projecting what sort of miseries he had in life. So they're projecting that he must have been a good and wonderful and beautiful and fantastic human being because he's handsome and he's a giant. But he must have also been miserable at the same time. So they're taking this drowned man and putting all their stories into him. And on that paradoxical level, he must have been happy and sad at the same time. And that's partly where the collective third works. Here comes a cat. There you go. That's partly how the collective third works. Here, it's a tricky one to really pull off, and that's part of the way he pulls it off. He doesn't really have any specific characters, really. That one old lady, really. So how do you really pull off emotional resonance when you don't really have a specific character? You have a character that they put all of their own stories into, and that reflects back onto the village, and that's a real experimental sort of echoing POV. I like to invent POVs that are echoing POVs just for fun. I have a couple of stories where people get inside of other people's heads, and so how do you actually define the POV of someone being inside somebody else's head? Which is just fun to play around with. But that's kind of a unique POV. The projected, what do you even call that? The projected collective third. But I think that's one of the problems with just the treatment of even something real basic like POV. A lot of the times the reinforcement is, whether it's direct or indirect, the reinforcement is keep a consistent POV. The only really good POV is close third. Whether you say it or not, that tends to be, because close third, just in the nature of something like a workshop, close third just translates very easily, therefore it works better, therefore there's reinforcement of that as the valid POV. How do you deal with really quirky, unique POVs, like projected collective third POVs, which is real playful and fun, and, it's unique. It has its own level of stimulation, and that whole dynamic of the story is going from that familiar, destimulated end of the spectrum to the novel, it's a short story, not a novel, but the novel, and meaning new, unfamiliar end of the spectrum, and that push and pull there. And that even goes to the POV, the collective third that could totally undermine stimulation. He's effectively enhancing that through that whole complicated dynamic of projection of their own feelings into Esteban, and adopting him and making him their own and what have you. It goes on like this, and there's a bit of complication. It's a real short story, so there's not a huge amount of actual conflict, but there's a little bit of conflict when the men get jealous, but then they see he's handsome too. If you'd wanted to turn it into a story, you might have a whole complicated plot of the men getting jealous. I don't think that's right for this story. And story structure tends to be dictated by what the story can do to enhance and optimize access to the visceral core. I think if you had it is possible to expand it into a full novel or something like that. And that might be the area to expand it into a full novel in that conflict. If there is any kind of conflict in the story, it's in the conflict of the men being jealous that the women are in love with this handsome drowned man. But I think it would have lost a lot. So Gabriel Garcia Marquez, in his magnanimous wisdom, recognized that it's better to keep it at 4 pages. And Collective Third is one of those. Hard to do. There are some like that. There are some novels like Virtue and Suicides, of course. Santiago does that as well. Things like blindness and things like that. Where was I? Oh yeah, the Collective Third. It's hard to sustain, but that's it's just the nature of how can you effectively sustain stimulation over a particular span. Have you set up the structure of the story and the elements of the story to sustain stimulation over the full novel length? That's why a lot of novel elements exist. They exist purely to extend the stimulation over the length of a novel. David Byrne has this whole theory about music being shaped by the space that it's in, and really story forms are shaped by the space that they're in. A short story. Why do short story elements exist? Because the short story is short. Why do novel elements exist? Because it's long. How do you extend stimulation over that long period of time? And so something like a Collective Third, it works a bit better in the short term because it's much harder to sustain stimulation when there's no characters, really. How do you write a story that doesn't really have any characters? Arguably. This is one of the few examples of where it works really well. And then the men see that he's handsome, and they start to celebrate them. And then they start to see that their village, and this is this dynamic once again, they start to see that their village is ugly. So they took their village for granted, and it's decayed in their lack of interest in it. And a lot of people talk about the purpose of literature as being heightening attention to things or heightening awareness of things. Seeing things you're familiar with for the first time. That's not something that you can really make a universal. But what's at the core of that whole notion of, and you'll hear this with like poetry all the time. Poetry is designed to make the familiar unfamiliar. That's one thing it can do, definitely. It can endow life into something that has become lifeless. But behind that, why has it become lifeless? It's become lifeless because it's so familiar, and it's the capacity of this familiar thing to stimulate us has been dulled by repeated access to it at this end of the spectrum. That's the actual universal thing going on. Not making the familiar unfamiliar. You can't actually apply that to every single successful literary work. Unless you force it and use confirmation bias. That's in another episode. But here's an example of that dynamic playing out. They start to recognize that their village is they had let their village become run down, but they wanted to make sure that the Esteban, the village Esteban is from must have been a good village. Oh well, let me go ahead and if I could find if I could find the right line. There's a lot of great lines that are about that. And they have this great funeral for him. Oh, if I could find the line. There's a lot of long sentences, so finding where the sentences start and stop. Oh, that's... Okay, here we go. They also knew that everything would be different from then on, that their houses would have wider doors, higher ceilings, and stronger floors, so that Esteban's memory can go everywhere without bumping into beams, and so that no one in the future would dare whisper, "The big boob finally died. Too bad. The handsome fool has finally died," because they were going to paint their houses, house fronts gay colors to make Esteban's memory eternal, and they were going to break their backs digging for spring among the stones and planting flowers on the cliffs, so that in the future, at dawn, the passengers on great liners would awaken suffocated by the smell of gardens on the high seas, and the captain would have to come down from the bridge in his dress uniform. So, I mean, just the basic idea there. Here's a good final line. I'll get to it in a second. That whole thing is a big long sentence. But the basic idea being that the change agent of this magical giant dead handsome man has created a sense of vitality. So he was dead, but he was the most living character in the whole village, most alive character in the whole village, the one with the most subjecthood in the whole village. And so he's endowed that onto them. So they go from this destimulation of, mundanity to the stimulation of novelty in the memory of Esteban. And that's, it's a great trajectory for a story. It doesn't work for every story, but a great trajectory for a story. That's such a long dress uniform. That whole thing's long sentence. Hold on. With his astrolabe as pole star and his war medals, promontory, he would say in 14 languages, "Look there where the wind is so peaceful now that it's gone to sleep beneath the beds. Over there where the sun's so bright that the sunflowers don't know which way to turn. Yes, over there, that's Esteban's village." So, it's great final line. Very long sentence as a final line. But it's not an ending where we find out who Esteban is and why he was gigantic. And so a lot of the mistake people make with a lot of stories is to look at the ending and say that the ending is the purpose. So if you compare, a lot of the mood in the story is similar to like a mystery story, like a Sherlock Holmes story. That uncanny uncertainty about the nature of someone's death. There's mystery about who Esteban is and how he died. To a degree it's a mystery. But the trajectory of the story, of the story is not moving towards understanding who actually killed him. That's reaching a level of homeostasis where you are in a familiar world. There's an introduction of this mysterious death that creates this heightened stimulation in your attempt to figure out the cause of this death, and that you reach homeostasis again when the detective, Sherlock Holmes, whoever, solves that murder. Here, the trajectory is not necessarily towards homeostasis, but there's a heightened stimulation in the presence of this dead body whose origin is uncertain, whose cause of death is uncertain, whose physical abnormality is uncertain, it heightens the stimulation. That gets closed off a bit once he leaves, but it has become changed in his absence. And so you sort of have that trajectory with the hero's journey, where you go from familiarity to unfamiliarity and back to homeostasis. But the vast majority of the time, the hero's changed just by the process. It's not a necessity. It's not an absolute, not a universal of all good characters that they are changed by their experience once they return to homeostasis. Esteban isn't changed. Sherlock Holmes isn't changed. But the village has changed. And it's a totally valid trajectory. Not the only trajectory possible, but I keep saying trajectory, even though I've been struggling with the word trajectory. Trajectory. It's a totally valid trajectory, but not the only possible one. But the reason it works is because the nature of the story itself, the value of the actual story itself, is the disruption of the homeostasis. The way it ultimately plays out, there's a whole wide variety. So when you create rules that say, here's how the story should play out, that limits the possibility. But if you recognize that the multitude, if you recognize, I pronounce recognize in a weird way. I've been trying to pronounce trajectory clearly, and it totally ruined, through my ability to pronounce the word recognize, out of homeostasis. But if you recognize what's at the core of why that particular structure works, you have nearly infinite possibilities of how to shape the story around that. And that's my point. So as I'm trying to develop a story about Old God and the Broken Heart, about this gigantic character that I love named Old God, certainly the mood is something that I want to achieve, and that's kind of a tricky thing because I've used Old God and the Broken Heart so many times that they've become mundane to me. They've become just normal sort of characters. The emotional center of it is their friendship, wanting to protect each other. The only real idea I've had so far, we'll see how this plays out, is Old God ends up meeting up with other gigantic characters, and that might be where the mundanity comes in. That to contrast with their giantness. Mundanity just in their personalities. So if Esteban, Esteban doesn't have a personality because he's dead. Just imagine if Esteban, and this is a totally different story, more my story than Gabriel Garcia Marquez's, my type of story than Gabriel Garcia Marquez's type of story. Imagine if Esteban came to the village and they projected all of these amazing things on him, and it turns out he's just a really normal guy. What sort of visceral impact would that have? It would have a very different visceral impact. And it would be built for a longer story, too. There's nothing wrong with Handsomest Drowned Man being built for a very short space. It works perfectly for that short space. But the whole idea of, having this group of giants... Hush. I can talk to other people. I can talk to other people. Hush. Why do you bark at me when I'm doing this? You wackadoo. So, Old God, hooking up with all these other giants who have a variety of personalities that are all mundane personalities. That's built for a longer story. Are you done? You done barking? I think I'm done with the video. If that's what you want me to be done with the video, I'll be done with the video. But anyway, that's the idea. Siku says, I need to stop now, and he's my boss, so... Isn't that right, Siku? You want me to stop? Okay. I gotta reach the stop button. Hold on. See you next time on My Friend the Rainbow Circle. Bye.